Hello everyone, and welcome to the webinar, Companion Diagnostics, Oncology Technologies and Pathways. We're happy you're all joining us today. I'm Derek Gingery, a senior writer with the Pink Sheet and Script. I'll be moderating the discussion. There's no question the diagnostics industry is a growing opportunity, especially as precision medicine and gene therapy gain more prominence. But questions and concerns remain about efficient approval of both the diagnostic and drug pieces by FDA. The agency is working to fix some of the problems associated with diagnostic review and approval, and we're going to take a look at the current market along with some of the challenges. With me is David Selmour, U.S. Editor-in-Chief of Informa's MedTech Insight publication, as well as Bridget Silverman, Managing Editor with the Pink Sheet and Script. Dave is going to discuss technology and regulatory drivers in the diagnostic space, and Bridget is going to look at the big pharma perspective, including trends, strategies, and future directions as pharma companies incorporate more diagnostics into drug development. Before we get started, I want to remind you that we want you to ask questions, so please feel free to submit them in the box below the video player on your screen. They will come to us and we will try to answer them. Also, a reminder that this presentation is being recorded and a link to the audio will be available in about 24 hours. So let's get right to it. Dave, how about you start us off?
Great. Thanks, Derek, and thanks everyone for joining. As mentioned, my name is David Selmour. I am the editor-in-chief of MedTech Insight, from that, I'm coming mostly from the perspective of diagnostics and implications for development of diagnostics, with the growing focus on targeted therapies and companion tests. So there's a lot happening in terms of technology development and regulatory reform and experimentation with new ways of overseeing diagnostics that I think is highly significant for pharma companies moving forward with targeted drug test paired therapies, whether internally or with a diagnostic partner. So, as Bridget will get into the pharma perspective after me, but, I'm going to first look more specifically at some of the technologies and regulatory paradigms that are behind the rise of companion diagnostics, which are, certainly increasingly important sector to the overall sort of market, and particularly oncology. So in terms of agenda, I'll give a brief sort of market overview for companion diagnostics, look at some technology drivers from a diagnostic standpoint in terms of that are driving forward and advancing this approach to targeted therapies and companion diagnostics, the regulatory context for this, and then look a little bit about how all this approaches and technology are leading to and requiring sort of more different ideas of collaborations in the space. So in terms of a sort of a general overview, companion diagnostics is a large and growing market, based on various market estimates, about, in the $2 billion range and growing upwards, to several fold over the next few years. As the topic headline for the webinar mentions oncology, and it certainly is dominating the oncology space, but certainly has relevance, and this discussion has relevance to other sectors as well, as the other fields, move more into this targeted medicine approach. Key element, obviously, is when it comes to something like this, is it really takes a team and is driving partnerships, particularly, obviously, between the pharma and diagnostic space and maybe some other players as well. But that's a really important part of the dynamic here. Some analysis by one of our sister publications in our group, it's really like diagnostic deals in themselves are kind of on the decline overall, but when it comes to companion diagnostics related deals, those are still hanging solid. And in general, of course, things like acquisitions, et cetera, are part of this mix as well. In terms of some numbers, it just kind of struck me as, there's about 40 companion diagnostics on the books right now with FDA in terms of formally how they list them. But there's a lot more when it comes to other types of diagnostics associated with drugs, or of course many of these approvals may be related to multiple drugs at a time. Even more recently, things called comprehensive diagnostics, which is something I'll talk a little bit more about. So there's a lot going on, and I think overall it's clear. Even just several years ago, it's more of a kind of a novelty in some sense to have this sort of paired test approved along with the drug, and it's becoming more and more routine, despite some challenges, obviously, still existing. Yes. So, in terms of, as I mentioned, some of the key factors. First of all, I was going to, other than the market driver, of course, it's a growing market, as I mentioned on the previous slide. One key driver is the technology itself. Advancing technology in the diagnostics space is making more and more possible in terms of assessing patients in the context of drug trials, et cetera, and coming up with more ways of segmenting, who can get what medicine, with increasing accuracy, increasing speed, and increasing throughput with diagnostics technology. It's supporting, more creative clinical trials, more indications options. So that's one thing I'm going to go through. And particularly, I'll talk about, next generation sequencing and liquid biopsy are the key sort of technology drivers, I think. And then the second part, as I mentioned, what I say is the regulation. I think that's the other sort of key, driver from the diagnostic standpoint of how this is moving forward, how it's able to move forward, is, historically, it's been a challenge in terms of regulation, bringing these two types of products together, different sort of standards, different processes and bureaucracies. But there's a real push for clarity, and increasingly, at the FDA in particular, spelling out in formal documents the experience they've had with individual reviews of, getting guidances and best practices together. There's a lot of a sort of outside the box thinking happening when it comes to regulation of in vitro diagnostics and new ways of approaching. Certainly, I don't want to suggest this is all resolved issues. A lot happening, a lot in the works. It's a work in progress, and there's challenges. I'll also include a mention in my slides of Europe, where I think things are a little bit behind, but we'll get moving forward. So the next slide here, talk about technology catalysts, and particularly, there's a lot that could be discussed here in the details, but I think two key points that are worth, sort of noting in terms of driving this field forward and important to what's happening next in targeted therapies and companion diagnostics is, first of all, next generation sequencing, and then liquid biopsy. You hear obviously more and more happening with NGS, that allows, the cost of sequencing a genome, et cetera, has gone down, and the technology is advancing of how to do that and incorporate into actual clinical practice versus just as a research tool. It really allows sort of more flexibility in assessing molecular subsets to target in trials, and new types of trial designs like basket trials, which may be mentioned later. And, it also opportunities for more scalability. You have these platforms in which you could, get more targeted therapies to be developed using the same test rather than keep having to go back to the drawing board for new assay platforms. So it's more bang for your buck for next-gen sequencing. And in particular, it's allowed the development not only of these sort of, get the individual test for the individual drug approvals, but this idea of more multi-drug assessments with multi-genome or genomic signature analysis. There's been a few recent approvals on that front, including Thermo Fisher approval for, multi-drug next-gen sequencing companion diagnostic, which I'll mention in a little more detail later, and also more recently, even later last year, comprehensive diagnostic, the Foundation One comprehensive diagnostic, which tests for like 324 genes at once and some genomic signatures to determine which of 17 drugs for different cancers might be appropriate. So what's being possible now because the technology is really advancing. And then under liquid biopsy, this is, essentially the ability to measure for circulating tumor DNA in the blood rather than having to go to a tissue biopsy. So that adds a lot of help in terms of more convenience, less invasiveness, that really could advance the idea and practice of companion diagnostics and how they're done in clinical trials and in clinical practice. Also makes things like serial testing and treatment tracking as you're taking the drug more feasible and easy. We've recently had some, milestones here with last year. Globally, there's been a few out from CAGR, et cetera, for several years, but last year in the U.S., Roche's Cobus got the first liquid biopsy companion diagnostic approval for Tarceva. So this is also, important. And recently, there's also been some breakthrough status designations for liquid biopsy companion diagnostics from the two companies, Foundation and Guardant. So these are really like where, key underlying technologies for what's ahead. Next, I'm going to move to go to the regulatory side of things for our next number of slides. And, as I said, there's a lot being put into practice here in terms of, formal best practices and documents that's made this really, like I said, into a more, not fully, but more routine process than it was just a few years ago. And that, started in part, it probably could point to some documents before this for sure, but the 2014, IVD companion diagnostic guidance really, just set out sort of the basics for how FDA is going to review, do a simultaneous review and simultaneous approval of drugs and a companion diagnostics together, and sort of the basics around that. And that sort of helped set sort of the stage, although certainly still leaving a lot of details open, but as a good starting point. And then a lot of that, it gets into the fact that, there's obviously two different centers within FDA involved, or three potentially, when it comes to, devices, drugs, and maybe biologics. And how do we bring that together, those very separate siloed bureaucracies together? Part of there's been various ways of dealing with that. Part of that is laying out these processes in the guidance document. So there was the companion diagnostic one in 2014, and now we have more recently in 2016 a draft co-development guidance that gets more into the long landscape of actually, developing these products. When do you bring, for instance, the IVD into the clinical process of the drug development process? At what point is reasonable and appropriate, or at least the preferred? What type of trial design consideration, timing? Do you need, what type of regulations do you need to start your trial when you have a test as a key part of it? Is it just a matter of the drug's typical IND, or is there some, do you need to be getting some clearance or approval from the device center, and how does that work? So there's some of those issues worked out there, but it's still, as I say, a work in progress and in draft form. And I think they're, kind of really working on that in conjunction with, other more specific efforts going on now at FDA to try to sort of lay out how this process works, and specifically how do you incorporate an IVDs into clinical trials. So they've had two recent draft guidances that I think go along with the effort on the more broader general co-development document that are specifically about, we're getting IVDs in drug trials, as I have at the top there. And, the one from, just last December is, basically, do you need an investigational device exemption or not when you do your trial? Perhaps most likely you're doing a drug trial, you would typically, go through the IND process with the drug center, and that's got its own details associated. But, drug companies may not be as familiar, but of course, there's a whole IDE process for starting trials in devices and diagnostics. And, when is that needed? When do you need to take these two routes? It really, depends essentially in a general sense on risk and what risk the test brings to the trial in terms of what will happen to the patients based on the results, et cetera. And most recently, just last month, FDA put out trying to take those ideas and really put it specifically in the area of oncology, laying out what could be a streamlined approach for in vitro diagnostics in oncology trials, where here it sets out particular cases where, you could just submit all your information to an IND to the drug center. You don't have to go separately to the device center for your separate IDE approval. That's, in the highest risk cases, that won't be possible, I think, but they're sort of laying out, how you would do that and when you could do that. So that's an important document that I think is going to be important part of sort of streamlining things a bit in terms of getting these trials started. And then, of course, FDA is also coming at this from the vantage point of the drugs themselves. Obviously, a very high interest in the agency in moving away from approval of drugs based on anatomy or histology and towards based on molecular alterations, subsets regardless of the anatomy. So not lung cancer with mutation X, but anybody with a solid tumor, and these biomarker assay results might be benefit from this drug. So there's a first recently in the past year or so. Again, Roche with their Keytruda approval of Keytruda for based on some genomic signatures, getting approval on various solid tumors, tissue agnostic, as they say. And last year, so the FDA has been sort of trying to sort of develop guidance that will help sort of different approaches related to these efforts. FDA issued a guidance on developing targeted therapies for low-frequency molecular alterations. Basically you use assays to enroll a range of molecular subsets into the trial and use that as a way of trying to get approvals in the space. And so that's something that's out recently that they're working to formalize. But the FDA has also said they're planning a guidance more specifically on tissue agnostic drug approval, and including an emphasis that's interesting, I think, on how a drug can qualify for orphan status when it which comes with incentives based on a molecular subset, genetic signature, et cetera, rather than the organ or the quote, disease. So these efforts will put even more emphasis on biomarkers and diagnostics, as part of the development process and part of the commercial, clinical process. So these are all just, moving forward with, we're sort of setting up these to make this more and more a baked-in approach to how you develop drugs with the diagnostic as part of it. So I was going to talk about sort of the more specifically on the IVD side, the in vitro diagnostic regulation. I think just wanted to note there's been a lot of effort to really kind of think through how to improve and speed up a regulation of in vitro diagnostics and to sort of modernize it. There's been certainly discussion of whether, diagnostics have been the bottleneck in companion diagnostic, targeted therapy reviews in some cases. And part of that is maybe based on, administrative bureaucratic issues or, different standards, et cetera. But in any case, I think part of this definitely has been with a focus of speeding up IVDs to advance, the goal of personalized medicine. So there's been, a lot of, some novel pathways that are things like the breakthrough program that have been developed in the past few years for devices that have been put to a lot of use for IVDs, new paradigms of regulation, specifically for next-generation sequencing, and there's been a lot of discussion of laboratory-developed tests, which I'll talk about in a separate slide in a moment. So first of all, there's when it comes to next-generation sequencing, they've really, it's obviously this is the core technology for the development of new targeted treatments. FDA has put a major emphasis on working up a more sort of bespoke paradigm for developing and approvals of new NGS-based assays, and it's still sort of something very in the works, but they've had multiple public meetings. They've started an FDA called Precision FDA, like an online community database platform, basically a cloud-based clearinghouse for researchers to assess and share data sets on NGS analyses. And so the idea is they're trying to create like a platform for different approaches to getting new next-gen sequencing assays approved without having to, the normal clinical trial development process for these doesn't work well for this area. So they're trying to come up with new approaches, and including, in particular, they put out some recent guidance documents to sort of lay out where their thinking is. And one of them in particular, I think, is relevant to streamlining development here on databases. Essentially, FDA is looking to encourage development and leveraging public databases to support regulatory decisions and approvals for next-generation sequencing assays. So if there's data out there that could be used to support a new marker on a system, a platform that's out there to be used as a official diagnostic, they want to put that to use. So a guidance finalized earlier this year is specifically focused on that area, describes how sponsors can rely on databases rather than relying on proprietary data sets and prospective data collection to support approvals. And it's really designed to, kind of partly encourage this practice and encourage development of more databases. So, that could be really important to streamline the advancement of targeted therapies with companion diagnostics, I think. And then just to mention, there was also a parallel guidance finalized at the same time on, sort of more broad considerations for the validation of NGS tests. And some important factors there in terms of focusing on consensus standards as a way to streamline reviews. But I should say that guidance is focused on germline, not somatic diseases, and specifically does not lay out the process for companion diagnostic validation. But I think it can be viewed as sort of a window into FDA's thinking and direction when it comes to these types of technologies. And then second on this slide, I was going to point to, just some of the novel pathways that I alluded to that have come up and really been put to use recently in the DX space, particularly the breakthrough program. So the drug breakthrough program has been around a bit longer. The device one has sort of gotten started in the past few years and evolved and picked up in the past year or two. And it essentially allows qualifying firms to benefit from very close collaboration with FDA reviewers, create novel clinical development pathways, maybe like streamlining things like pushing more data to the post-market rather than have to do it before approval when possible, different types of statistics, and just thinking things through. So as this is not just for diagnostics, but it's really being leveraged in the diagnostic space. The first device of any kind to gain approval through the breakthrough pathway just this past year was in fact the Foundation One companion diagnostics, comprehensive companion diagnostic test that I mentioned earlier. And several, as I also mentioned, some liquid biopsy tests have been granted breakthrough status. Liquid biopsy companion diagnostics, that would be sort of multi-analyte, multi-drug tests. So it's really a program that can, certainly something that has implications for targeted therapy development. I think particularly maybe can go hand in hand with drug breakthrough designations. Also just mentioned here the de novo process. That is actually not a new process, but it's something that's growing in use in recent years. And really for diagnostics in particular, it gets more use. This is basically a way to, designate a product thing that you could say, this is more moderate risk. We don't need these steep PMA requirements in a particular situation. But even if there's nothing on the market that's just like this new test we have, so we can maybe, be more flexible about what requirements we have. This is not something put to use specifically for companion diagnostics right now, but I think as we move forward, this could have implications for streamlining the process. And then the last one I have on this slide is pre-certification, and that's really something that's being bandied about by FDA, and it's not something in the process right now. But the idea is to maybe the agency can come to terms with sort of a processes, designs, how a particular company works, develop trust in that company, and because of that, allow that company to be engaged with less pre-market scrutiny than they would have otherwise. This is a really new approach for FDA. It's actually being tested in digital health, but the commissioner of FDA has really talked about this in conjunction with diagnostics. It's being put to use there in some ways in diagnostics, and I think over time we could see this maybe having relevance in the companion diagnostic space. And that sort of leads a lab-developed test. I won't spend too much time on this slide, but just sort of say, if people aren't familiar, lab-developed tests are basically tests that are developed by a lab as a service to be used out of that lab. They haven't been historically actively regulated by FDA, but that leads up a complication because companion diagnostics typically would need to be approved by FDA. Some of these tests have a lot of relevance to use for drug treatment decisions and could be used as companion diagnostics. So FDA is really trying to think outside the box in sort of ways that they could get labs as opposed to your typical companies that are developing test kits that are packaged with labeling, et cetera, get those labs to come to FDA and get approvals for things that might be relevant for personalized medicine. And they're coming up with more creative ways of doing that. So yeah, there's a few different ways they're considering, including the pre-certification idea I mentioned, and this is something that really could get addressed by Congress. Even there's some momentum for that in the coming years. So going here, we're spending primarily on FDA, but I was just going to include a slide because it is something that I think some important things are happening, and it's worth mentioning that in Europe, there really is some changes to be looking out for here with regards to companion diagnostics issues. They're not. I don't think there's as advanced in terms of creating the level of guidelines and best practices for these approach. But I think an important issue to look forward to is that, people may be familiar, there's new regulations for both medical devices and for IVDs, the IVD regulation, which was, adopted last year and is going to be fully in effect in a few years, 2022. And it, for the first time in the EU, actually officially defines companion diagnostic. And it firstly sets out rules for how they would be regulated. Before there wasn't that sort of formality, and in some cases there may not have been clear, regulation. So this could be, clarifying the situation in Europe a lot, but also maybe adding some more requirements for different sorts of situations depending on the test and what's involved. So it really envisions cooperation between the notified bodies, which are these sort of third-party entities that essentially assess devices and diagnostics to get on the market, with the medicines regulators, which is like the EMA or the country authority. So it really sets out a new process. It will definitely be creating some more clarity in Europe than exists now, but again, could be more burdens and requirements. And then, as part of that, Europe is looking to sort of set out sort of similar guidelines and approaches as they put out a recent concept paper on companion diagnostics, trying to get comments and figure out sort of the way forward in a similar way that FDA has been doing. We're not spending, a lot of time to, the primary focus here wasn't reimbursement issues, but from the test standpoint, from the diagnostic standpoint, it's actually a key issue and challenge for, companies and companies making these advanced diagnostics used for these purposes. The payment issue is a key factor in actually rolling these out. There's certainly issues and questions and uncertainties related to that. In terms of getting, Medicare reimbursement and things like that, there was a legislation a few years ago, PAMA, that sort of set out a new sort of so-called market-based approach to getting reimbursement rates for advanced diagnostics, including companion diagnostics. And there was a lot of support for that, but for the approach, but the way it's been rolled out has been not what's expected. And there's some, company by company, there's concerns about what the rates for these tests will be, and that has an impact on the ability to market and viability and things like that. So that's a still issue that is being sort of back and forth addressed between the industry and the Medicare agency, and that's something that is sort of a little bit of uncertainty involved right now. On the coverage side of things, in terms of coverage determinations and what policies are, actually there's been some positive signs there. FDA, another program that's been sort of novel within FDA over the past few years, is the parallel review program, where FDA will partner with CMS to sort of reach an approval decision at the same time as the proposed coverage decision. And that it's only been used, frankly, or it's resulted in approvals only sparingly so far, but the most recent one has been the Foundation One test that I've mentioned a few times was able to gain both FDA approval and CMS coverage, Medicare coverage that was finalized recently, and the national coverage policy that was pretty positive. I think a lot of the developers in this space thought of it as a good thing. It leaves some flexibility while it provides coverage for that particular test. It leaves a lot of flexibility for coverage of tests that may not have current approval for companion diagnostics, but can be used in different ways, and also for getting coverage immediately once you do get FDA approval. So there's some positive signs there. And then, so finally, I was going to just, mention, just sort of what I think is interesting from a diagnostics and from a pharma standpoint is a lot of what all this is happening. I think it's making the industry think a little bit differently about how different industries and companies think differently about how they work together and what needs to be done, what type of collaborations are needed that I think are more creative and interesting than they had been in the past, because of all these new multi-comprehensive tests and everything like that. So I was just going to, wanted to highlight two examples of that I thought were interesting for just to think about. One is I mentioned very briefly earlier, the Thermo Fisher Oncomine companion diagnostic test was approved last summer. And it was the first multi-drug companion diagnostic approved by the FDA ever, meaning that you do that test and it has multiple markers involved, and then it's a decision matrix for which drug, which medication would be the most appropriate of a choice of three different ones for a patient in lung cancer. And for that, it was interesting in that they partnered with both two competing pharma companies in that space at the same time for the development of this test and these drugs, Pfizer and Novartis, and they were able to, be involved in those different trials for those drugs, but work together with those companies and even go to sort of FDA shared meetings together in some cases with both companies because of this. And so it's an interesting example, I thought, of where things are going to getting sort of this competitors involved with the same projects for these types of, as we get more comprehensive in our approach to these things. Obviously, a lot of challenges here when it comes to confidentiality and issues like that. But, advantages, like now you have this platform that tests for all these markers. You have these new indications. Maybe you could then use that same platform for development of a follow-up indication or drug, et cetera. So it adds efficiency. So I thought that was one interesting recent example to point out. And then the other one was in terms of the immunotherapy PD-1, PD-L1, obviously a lot going on there in terms of development of drugs for targeting those pathways. But there's an interesting, collaboration that's ongoing there called the Blueprint Project, which is trying to, it's several drug firms, several diagnostic firms involved, and they're basically trying to work out, like, okay, you get this drug combination diagnostic approval together, but then you want to get a few drugs, few diagnostic approvals. It becomes a little bit more complicated in the clinical space for patients, for doctors, particularly, and patients. So they're, working together to address those matrix of different options available there, and have recently done some studies in terms of showing, maybe certain assays in the market are interchangeable for different drugs, et cetera. So, that's another interesting thing that I thought was worth pointing out. So, that's, I think, where I was going to leave it for now, and pass it off back to Derek to transition us forward. So, thanks.
Thanks a lot, Dave. That was a great overview of the current landscape. Bridget, can you give us the pharma's perspective on this space?
Thanks, Derek. I think from the pharma perspective, where we start is that precision medicine, or more broadly, the development of drugs targeted at specific genetically defined patients or disease groups, subgroups, is already proven a successful strategy. And so today we're going to look just a little bit at what we have learned from the experience so far. And one of the things that has been very nice is that last week Health Affairs published a very nice comprehensive analysis of novel approvals by the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research over the past 5 years that illustrates how quickly precision medicine has really been taken up. And this really dovetails nicely with a lot of the coverage that we've been doing over the years. But what the Health Affairs article, which is by a University of Queensland researcher and colleagues, found that from 2013 to 2017, almost 1/4 of FDA's CDER's novel approvals qualified as precision medicine. Oncology is by far the most common therapeutic area for these approvals. And these approvals, precision medicine approvals, are seeing faster development and faster review than non-precision approvals. The precision medicine also dovetails nicely into FDA's regulatory incentive framework on the drug side. Again, this is data from the Health Affairs article that really shows how there's a significantly higher rate of uptake of breakthrough designations, priority review, accelerated approval, all of the parts of FDA's toolkit for expedited pathways. Yet, as Dave's presentation showed very nicely, there's still a tremendous amount of regulatory uncertainty. To an extent that's just unavoidable when the science moves quickly. And to manage that regulatory uncertainty, the key thing that sponsors can do is to meet with FDA, take advantage of the expedited review pathways, because the situation is, there's so much flux that working directly is really the key to success. The other thing you can do is look closely at approval actions that have been done. Now, one of the baseline problems you run into here is a matter of definition. You can essentially imagine a lot of overlapping Venn diagrams with all of these terminology. Precision medicine, genomic medicine, personalized medicine. But the consistent theme here is the idea that drug development can incorporate information that is provided by diagnostics. We are already seeing what had been the classic idea of the companion diagnostic giving way to a more flexible model that's sort of becoming known as complementary diagnostics. And that's something we'll talk about a little bit later. But briefly, companion diagnostics model is essentially that the indication for a drug states that the population is limited to patients with a certain molecular characteristic as detected by an FDA-approved test. In a complementary diagnostic approach, the labeled indication does not specify a molecular characteristic, but clinical trial data in labeling will describe trial data that uses that is separated out that way. And knowing which kind of labeling you want has implications not only for trial design and development, but later on for reimbursement and marketing. So it's important to think about early. And the rise of precision medicine has really forced a reevaluation of thinking for everybody and reevaluating the drug diagnostic silo mentality. And again, Dave really touched on this, but I think the key here is that you're really seeing a truly cross-disciplinary mentality emerging here. On the regulatory side, you have the formation of the Oncology Center of Excellence, which can really represent the codification of a sea change in perspective at FDA, putting the disease first instead of the modality. So instead of having CDER or CBER or CDRH sort of taking the lead. It codifies a lot of the inter-center consultation that was already going on, but fine-tuning and streamlining is what's really needed right now because a lot of the problems are choke points, and identifying how to get through and make the process, streamline the process is important. And on the pharma side, Big Pharma is increasingly incorporating diagnostic platforms into the early stages of development, baking it in, not as an afterthought. Roche has, of course, been a leader for a long time in both drugs and diagnostics, they have really modeled taking a systematic, broad, and deep look at genomic data across all of their trials and feeding those insights back into the discovery and development engine. Roche has a big position in both traditional immunohistochemistry tests with Ventana and next-generation sequencing with Foundation. Roche is certainly not alone. Just last month, Bristol Myers Squibb signed a big NGS collaboration with Illumina to use Illumina's NGS technology to support Bristol's oncology portfolio. So this is something that is a very active space. At the Pink Sheet, we've long run a series of sort of deep dives into FDA approval documents that we call them drug review profiles. And in the course of this, we've identified some themes in FDA's review of oncology drug diagnostic combinations. In the course of this talk, I'll focus on two examples, Celgene and Agios's Adhesive and AstraZeneca and now Merck's Lynparza, to illustrate how some of these themes play out. If you want to read more, the drug review profile story from March is in your packet of background materials. But the main themes we want to touch on here are that biomarkers need to have a reason for being included in drug labeling. You need to make sure that they are correlating with clinically relevant characteristics, and you need to make sure that you are not excluding patients who could benefit from treatment. Another point is that FDA prefers prospective to retrospective analyses. Sometimes this is difficult, and you have to use a retrospective sample. If you have to, look for lots of supporting evidence to make your case. And finally, post-marketing studies are an integral part of the regulatory framework at this point and should be considered early on in a development program because they will be happening, so plan for them. So FDA's CDER's approach to companion diagnostics is really informed by the combination product model, and each component of a combination, be it two drugs, be it a drug or a diagnostic, has to show and demonstrate its contribution to the whole. But at the same time, because of this, the FDA is allowing trials that can support both the approval of the pharmaceutical and the companion diagnostic. And here we can really look at Celgene and Agios's Adhesive for IDH2 mutant relapsed and refractory AML, which is a product that really sped to market. Just 5 years elapsed from the IND filing to its full approval. Since the drug inhibits the mutated IDH2 enzyme, the decision to start out with a paired therapy companion diagnostic program is relatively easy. Nonetheless, it is still an excellent example of the kind of cross-disciplinary approach that FDA has endorsed in its draft guidances. In this case, that the clinical evidence to support approval of Abbott's PMA for the companion in vitro diagnostic, the real-time IDH2 assay, was generated by the trials that supported approval of the drug in acidinib. The test was used prospectively to select patients for the efficacy phase of the pivotal phase 1/2 study. The trial tested both blood and bone marrow specimens with the real-time assay. Patients with an IDH2 mutation were retested with a validated NGS test. Then the high agreement rates between those two tests supported the analytical performance of the real-time IVD and enabled the simultaneous approvals. I think it's important to note here that FDA likes the specificity in biomarkers. In the Adhesive example above, for example, the Abbott real-time test used in the clinical trial detects single nucleotide variants coding 9 IDH mutations. The drug is approved for the IDH2 mutation. Agios actually has another drug under review, ivosidenib, that is for IDH1 mutated AML. So specificity is important. You can especially see the expansion of the importance of specificity and the expansion of specified mutations in the case of EGRF inhibitors in non-small cell lung cancer. This is one of the earliest of the targeted therapy drug classes, and the number of named mutations has gone up with each generation and significantly has come to include acquired resistance mutations. Outside of oncology, if you look at the labeling for Vertex cystic fibrosis franchise, which is led by Kalydeco, it's up to something like 40 specified mutations. As we've said, FDA really prefers analyses to be done prospectively. Nonetheless, unmet medical need can unlock the agency's regulatory flexibility, as AstraZeneca demonstrated with Lynparza. Unlike Adhesive, where the mechanism of action shapes the targeted indication, the PARP inhibitor Lynparza was not initially envisioned as a candidate for companion diagnostic co-development. The company conducted a trial known as Study 19 for maintenance treatment of platinum-sensitive recurrent ovarian cancer. This study enrolled patients without regard to BRCA status. After the primary analysis of progression-free survival in 2011, AstraZeneca declared the project over. But a year later, genomic analyses renewed AstraZeneca's interest by indicating a greater PFS improvement in the subgroup of patients with germline BRCA mutations. At the time of randomization, BRCA mutation status was known for only 37% of the ITT population. So, in 2012, AstraZeneca went back and tested all available blood samples for deleterious G-BRCA mutations, resulting in 79% of the population having a known mutation status by local testing or by the companion diagnostic, which is from Myriad. In 2014, AstraZeneca used this data to support an NDA for accelerated approval of olaparib for maintenance treatment of deleterious G-BRCA mutated ovarian cancer as detected by the Myriad companion diagnostic based on the retrospective analysis. Now, FDA was not comfortable with this. In particular, FDA reviewers stressed that post-hoc analyses entail a loss of randomization. And convenience samples, in this case, patients with whole blood samples available for retrospective testing, is not sufficient to support approval, FDA said. The small sample size, this is a quote from FDA review materials, the small sample size of G-BRCA-M patients and the retrospective identification of this patient population calls into question the reliability of the estimation of treatment effect. After an FDA advisory committee recommended against approval, AstraZeneca took the unusual task of submitting a major amendment that shifted the indication to a non-maintenance claim for heavily pretreated ovarian cancer patients identified by the companion diagnostic based on a different trial that had prospective identification. That indication was approved in 2014. There's a silver lining for AstraZeneca on the initial indication, the maintenance indication. After they submitted the indication again with the support of another phase 3 trial, the SOLO-2 trial, FDA did approve Lynparza in 2017 for maintenance treatment of platinum-sensitive recurrent ovarian cancer. Importantly, this approval was without restriction by BRCA mutation status, so it's a broader claim than they initially had gone for several years before. The price to be paid for FDA's regulatory flexibility in approvals, like in the case of Lynparza, often comes in post-marketing. The agency's ability to require post-marketing safety investigations and to require confirmatory studies for accelerated approval gives the agency the confidence to take chances on less than ideal data sets. Savvy sponsors can use these confirmatory studies to both answer FDA's questions and to lay the groundwork for expanded usage. For Lynparza, for example, FDA's 2014 accelerated approval of the fourth line and later indication included the phase 3 SOLO-2 trial as the confirmatory trial for the accelerated approval. So the SOLO-2 trial thus served to support both full approval of Lynparza as well as the maintenance claim in 2017. Now, importantly, FDA is aware of the flux in science in this area, and regulation gives reviewers wide latitude when addressing serious unmet needs, which means the agency is generally willing to work with sponsors to get products to FDA and through FDA faster. With Adhesive, for example, the sponsors originally intended to submit an NDA based on the phase 2 portion of a phase 1-2 trial, but decided to move ahead on the basis of data from the phase 1 portion due to high unmet need and promising efficacy. That produced less data than FDA is comfortable having in an NDA, but instead of asking the company to hold off on submission, the agency asked the sponsors to include data with a later cut date when it became available during the review. So again, this is a case of FDA is willing to work with sponsors to get what data it can get when that data is available. FDA also extends its flexibility to how diagnostic information is presented in labeling. Adhesive is an example of a classic targeted therapy companion diagnostic combo. The labeled indication incorporates use of the companion diagnostic, reflecting the use of the test to prospectively select patients for the pivotal trial. The Lynparza label for platinum-sensitive recurrent ovarian cancer maintenance shows how the agency can adopt that model for less clear-cut data. Now, FDA in this case was very concerned about excluding patients who could potentially benefit. As a Lynparza reviewer said, it would not be appropriate to separate out a subgroup from an overall positive trial unless there was a clear detriment to that subgroup. The agency noted signs that patients without germline BRCA mutations could still benefit from Lynparza, although potentially at a lower level than patients who are positive for the mutation, and that other biomarkers like homologous replication deficiency potentially could be at play. So the agency left the indication more broad as opposed to unnecessarily excluding some of these patients who could benefit for reasons we don't yet know exactly. Similarly, you can see FDA and industry backing away from the PD-1/L1 companion diagnostics in checkpoint inhibitor immuno-oncology indications. In lung cancer and bladder cancer especially, the earliest indications in the space had limitations by PD-L1 status, but labeling has increasingly moved towards first lower PD-L1 thresholds or to complementary diagnostic style labeling where the indication does not specify the test to be used, but trial data that is separated out by biomarker is presented in labeling for physicians to review. And this brings us to the idea that FDA trusts doctors to weigh evidence. Lynparza reviewers, for example, noted that BRCA testing is standard in contemporary management of ovarian cancer. So the agency was reassured that patients would have that information to inform prescribing, even if it was not specified in the indication. FDA said that current ovarian cancer practice guidelines recommend it in all patients. Thus, while not associated with olaparib specifically, in the course of standard practice, patients and providers should still be able to make an informed decision regarding the magnitude of benefit to expect from olaparib. Now, what's coming is really going to kind of blow up the framework that has been established so far, because FDA is going to need to figure out ways to accommodate, as Dave explained, far more complex combinations and arrays of biomarker data than it has. The liquid biopsy technology that Dave referenced can also make a significant improvement in clinical trials because it makes sample collection easier, so you can incorporate the diagnostic more thoroughly into both trials and in clinical practice. Now, as we've looked for clues as to how the regulatory approach is going to evolve, the tumor mutation burden is I think something that's a potential model for how some of these questions could be answered. Tumor mutation burden is measured by NextGen Sequencing, and it refers to the number of mutations in tumor cells. The high mutation burden is thought to be associated with better response to treatment. And Bristol has really highlighted the potential of the tumor mutation burden biomarker in its discussion of the data from its pivotal Checkmate 227 trial, because it found that a subset of first-line NSCLC patients it thought could identify as likely responders. But both regulators and practitioners will need to consider the role that this data plays in guiding treatment. So that is just something to keep an eye on as we go forward. We could talk more about the specifics of how this PD-1 testing is playing out with just images, but I think it might be more interesting to go to questions at this point. Derek?
Sounds good. Thanks a lot, Bridget. We're going to move to the question and answer portion of the webinar. Questions already are coming in, but again, if you have any questions, please feel free to submit them through the webinar portal below. Let's see here. First question. Dave, as you alluded to, the lack of FDA's review time for the diagnostic component of a targeted therapy compared to the drug has been a big area of frustration for drug companies because it can slow the overall approval process. Has this improved?
Thanks, Derek. Well, I'm sure it's obviously case by case, but yeah, I mean, my sense is that there have been improvements overall as companion diagnostic approvals have become more frequent, as FDA has been moving forward, becoming more flexible, things like complementary diagnostics, et cetera, as an option. Certainly not perfect, but I think the breakthrough pathway that I mentioned is one sort of new thing in the past few years for devices that has maybe provided more of an incentive for on the device side to move quickly when there's, say, a breakthrough drug that needs the diagnostic going along with it. And there was, also mention of, obviously in terms of bureaucratic issues, the Oncology Center of Excellence, which Bridget mentioned, is something that, that type of model where you're sort of getting outside the center silos, I think it's certainly had a near-term impact so far. And in general, FDA has been sort of working on improving under its, combination product authority in general, which includes various types of products, but working on streamlining consultations, et cetera, between the different centers, obviously, and coming up with councils and other types of approaches that sort of make it less of a barrier for the different centers to work together and get information from each other. So I think they've been positive steps. I think they have had an impact on actual reviews, but, we obviously, I think it continues to evolve.
Okay, that actually transitions well to this one for Bridget. With cross-disciplinary thinking now going on at FDA, is there any indication of how it's working, such as at the Oncology Center of Excellence?
Well, I think that the Oncology Center of Excellence, we've got, about a year of approvals, and they continue to come fast and furious. Oncology reviews have really been a tremendous historical success story for FDA and continue to be. I think that a lot of what we're seeing now is ways to just get it, to tighten up the process even more than it has been.
Okay. Let's see here. Another one for Dave. You mentioned reimbursement in the FDA CMS Parallel Review Program. How substantial of a challenge is the reimbursement issue compared to regulations for the diagnostic side of the drug test companions?
Well, yeah, reimbursement is definitely an area of focus and challenge. The recent national coverage determination I mentioned for next-generation sequencing companion diagnostics is definitely seen as a positive. As I sort of alluded to, the final version of that policy was really, the proposed version had been more restrictive, and the final version was much more flexible and provides some, kind of a growth path for some of these tests to sort of gain early reimbursement while they're even if they haven't been they're not yet companion diagnostics. So that's been positive. But as I mentioned, on the payment side of things, there's still a lot of questions. There's a lot of optimism a few years ago with this CAPAMA reform in terms of reimbursement rate setting, less likely they were hopefully to see more predictable rates, et cetera. But the way it's been implemented, there's been concerns. Some companies are happy with where their rates are, but there's concerns about predictability and what's likely to happen year to year. So yeah, there's definitely still some questions and challenges.
Okay. Bridget, this one's for you. Let's see. You talked about how we're seeing more in complex biomarkers. Is there any indication how FDA is going to handle these, especially given that it's been mandated to revamp the biomarker qualification process? Is the agency's qualification review process going to be able to keep up?
The qualification process, as it has played out, is not going to be able to keep up. And I think the biomarker qualification program, which is one of FDA's drug development tools programs under the 21st Century Cures Act, has issued final guidance on, I believe, still just 3 biomarkers, none of which are in oncology. One is in, I think, COPD, aspergillosis. So this is a program that is moving slowly and outside of the cancer space, which is where biomarkers are really revolutionizing how drug development is conceived of. So I think that what's a better way to look at what's going on at FDA is to look at the specific guidances and experiences and examples coming out of the Oncology Center of Excellence and the Oncology Review Divisions before. One thing to really keep an eye on is the guidance development process on tissue agnostic indications, because it's one thing to bear in mind is FDA is going to be treating these essentially as indications of necessity to pick up people with very rare conditions who otherwise would not get treated, or is FDA viewing them as less of a necessity and more of a choice? I think that they're leaning towards the necessity side, which has implications for if you choose to go for a tissue agnostic indication as opposed to for a more traditional histology-based indication.
Okay. Let's see, I think we've got time for one more if Dave can make it quick. Let's see. Laboratory-developed tests. How will reforms to FDA's approach to this category of diagnostics matter to drug developers?
Right. So I mentioned those, and that's sort of it's sort of a specialized area, but I think has a lot of relevance. There's tons of laboratories around that are or companies that have set themselves up as laboratories that are developing very advanced tests that from NextGen Sequencing, et cetera, that have a lot to say about treatment direction. But those labs, they're not typically, because of how the system is set up, they don't typically go through FDA approval. And so they could, sort of offer their services, but that doesn't necessarily work when we're looking for a more formalized labeling approach for a diagnostic. So, FDA coming up with ways of sort of getting those labs to them on a voluntary basis right now is they're coming up with these creative approaches, even using things like, these labs are regulated under CLIA, which is sort of overseeing the lab itself, not the test. You leveraging some of those processes to support an FDA approval. FDA is looking at creative things to do that. They're also talking to Congress about totally new approaches for diagnostics that can incorporate these types of tests in addition to IVDs. So as one sort of new regulated product area that could, but in any case, the point is there's a lot of implications for a lot of these laboratories are developing that might have value for companion diagnostics for targeted therapies, but to make them fully useful, there needs to be a clear way for these tests to get through the FDA. So that, I think, is why it's kind of important for drug developers if they're looking for options for companion diagnostics.
Okay, great. Well, let's see, we're at time, so that's all the time we have today. Thanks to everyone who joined us, and if we didn't get to your question, I'm sorry. We've got a couple of requests or questions about the slides. Those are going to be, if you need to see the slides again, they're going to be available in the on demand in the resources section. Otherwise, thanks again for joining us, and make sure everybody have a great day.